All right, everyone, we are back with another episode of the Kyle Anslone Show. And returning today is Kelley Vlahos, who is, of course, a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and the editorial director of Responsible Statecraft. And, of course, the host of the very great and informative podcast, Trip to the Beltway Fantastic. So if you're looking for more foreign policy expertise and breakdowns to listen to, certainly check out Kelley's show. Kelley, welcome back. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing well, and had a very interesting weekend, Kelley. It's always crazy when the news sounds a little bit good, and I certainly want to talk to you about the developments going on with Trump's policy towards Israel and Ukraine. But you had a really important article last week, and I think it didn't get as much tension as it should have. U.S. Gaza Pier op was more than a flop; it was a gigantic hazard. And really what you get into and you break down here is that, yes, this is a couple $100 million of U.S. taxpayer money that was essentially lost at sea. It would have been better if our, military had just taken $200 million in cash and thrown it off the side of one of the destroyers. That certainly would have been more productive than what happened. But you actually get into and break down and say, this was really dangerous for our servicemen. So please explain.
Yeah, no, and I hate to laugh because it's really not funny. And I'm really not one to laugh at the foibles of and the failures of the military, because I think in this case, Kyle, this wasn't the military's preference to build this pier. As you remember, Joe Biden announced in his State of the Union address last year. So we're talking early 2024 that the U.S. military was going to build this pier at the end of the beach in Gaza, and it was going to be accompanied by another floating pier out off the coast of Cyprus, in which they were going to bring humanitarian aid in from international donors, bring it up down to the pier. U.S. military would drop it off, and then humanitarian aid workers would bring it into Gaza. It would be surging aid into Gaza, which was in desperate need, as it has been for 18 months now, of just medical supplies and food. And what happened was it took months for this thing to get together. And then when it did, it basically fell apart. And from what we understand now, that the U.S. military had warned the Biden administration behind the scenes not to do this. They smelled failure. It was being done too fast. There were a lot of logistical hiccups and obstacles that the military had anticipated, but this was a big PR stunt, really, by the Biden administration, in my mind, to deflect attention from the fact that it was failing in its diplomatic policy with Israel over the war. And so they rush jobbed this thing. It literally fell apart at least 2 times. It had to be abruptly stopped because of the winds and the waves. There were a number of service members, including civilians as well, who are working with the military, who were injured, not critically, not enough to they weren't injured for life or anything, but I mean, they were hurt enough where they had to be taken off the job. And at least one service member was killed in a forklift accident. He was in the hospital. He was only 22 years old. He was in the hospital for 5 months before he succumbed to his injury. So we had we would put our members of our military in harm's way. In addition to that, the aid workers on the ground who were supposedly, who were supposed to be putting this food into warehouses and then getting it into Gaza, had been shot at by militants. We were never really told who exactly had launched mortar fire at these aid workers, and they were injured as well. Don't have a lot of details on that. And even the further bottom line is that none of the aid actually got to the Gazans inside. All of it was put in, that they actually managed to get onto the pier and into these warehouses on the beach, ended up just staying there and rotting, or God knows where else they went, but they didn't go into Gaza. And so it was a failure on a number of counts, and cost over $300 million, probably more than that when you consider the equipment that had been either damaged or destroyed in all of these efforts. I do not blame the military, other than the fact that, hey, they had to go along with it. They had to do what the administration had basically foisted upon them. So they had come out with the inspector general with a major report just last week, which I had written about, that basically spelled out everything that I just said. It's not looking good. And it doesn't look good actually for any future projects that might incorporate these J lots, which are these massive piers. Like, think of it like almost like you put together Legos. They brought all the pieces out, put them together, attach them to the beach. But experts who had talked about this ahead of time, like engineering experts, this was going to be very difficult without having a number of U.S. engineers and military personnel on the ground. And I think one of the things that the Biden administration did not want to do is that he didn't want U.S. troops on the ground. Well, that meant that we didn't have the right people in place to make sure that this thing worked. And so I'm not an engineer, but it seemed to me that there were a lot of warnings that were ignored so that they could somehow have this sort of photo op, this massive photo op. But even that didn't work, and it made things worse.
Right. And Kelley, one of the things that I find are my initial thoughts on this when I first heard about this pier was just it seemed impossible to me that you would really be able to drive essentially a semi truck carrying all this aid hundreds of feet was essentially just like a floating metal barge. And
Yeah.
then once it was completed, I was astounded by how crappy it looked. I mean, I
Yeah.
do not have high expectations for the US Navy. I remember the literal combat ship, the Zumwalt class of destroyers, right? We actually developed a US Navy destroyer that didn't have a main weapon. Right, like the failures of the U.S. Navy are entirely unbelievable and without scale, but this looked unbelievably crappy to me, and yet they tried to use it day after day after day, and it seemed all along that they were really kind of fooling with their definitions of what boots on the ground meant anyways. There were
Right.
US MRAPs photographed in 2 feet of water. Is that
Yeah.
not boots on the ground if the
Yeah.
tires are still getting a little bit wet? Do they have to reverse a little bit at low tide in order to make sure that they're not on the ground? I mean, this was really concerning to me.
There's a lot of funny stuff going on. And I think the tragedy of this is that the aid never got in. And so I think if you had a situation where you had got like tons of aid coming in from international donors and gets onto this pier, and then they drive it into the beach, and then there are people waiting who are authorized to go through the checkpoints and get this aid into the starving Palestinians inside. I think most of us would have been like, okay, so it didn't, like it eventually falls apart, but at least it got X amount of aid into Gaza. The problem was that the Israelis, I don't believe, were ever committed to letting this assistance get through the checkpoints. They allowed us to spend the millions and millions of dollars on building this thing and going through all of the performative motions of saying, we are going to marshal our American might to help the people of Gaza, and then just let it sit there. So that's another thing to think about, is like, okay, you can't take them at their word. So today, they're saying that they're going to institute a new humanitarian aid program in Gaza that's going to be led by Israel, that is going to engage US private military contractors, that is going to engage some Swiss based humanitarian aid organization that nobody knows about, that somehow they're going to get all of this assistance, food, medical supplies, whatever, to Gazans, and they're gonna wipe out any of the other organizations that have been operating there for the last 20 some odd years, and that somehow we're to believe that this is actually going to happen, as said by Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. No, it's not happening. They're not letting anything in now. They let nothing in when we actually were knocking at the door with the stuff. that they mean to starve these people out. That's part of the plan.
Right. And I think the UN said that even if they do move forward with this plan, a lot of what it looks like what they're doing is basically using the aid as bait to get the Palestinians to leave northern Gaza, central Gaza, where there's no food, force them close to the southern border with Gaza. And then once you cut off the aid and they're there, it's much easier to push the population just all into Egypt, the Sinai. And I guess from
Ugh.
there, it's somebody else's problem. But that really seems to be the route that Israel wants to go down this. And up until Thursday of last week, Kelley, I would have said that Donald Trump is happily just, skipping along right in front of Netanyahu as we brought down this road to genocide. But suddenly we start getting reports that Trump is fed up with Netanyahu, that Trump is breaking with Netanyahu. There's,
Hmm.
reports that Netanyahu is saying that Israel needs to detox from Israeli aid, which we talk about more in a minute. But then we had this, I think, the very conclusive thing and concrete thing happening that actually suggests there may be some truth here. And that is this post by Trump on his True Social account that Edon Alexander, an Israeli American, an IDF soldier who was, on active duty, like in an Israeli tank unit on October 7th when he was captured by Hamas. And he has now been freed. He was released just before we recorded this show. And initially, when these negotiations were going on between the US and Hamas, Israel freaked out. The US hostage envoy, Adam Boehler, lost his job for this, right? He was negotiating the release of an American, and the Israelis said, no, we don't like this. And Adam Boehler lost his job. This was
Yeah.
astounding to me. And now this man is free, which, fantastic for him and his family. Glad there's one less hostage in Gaza. But this certainly doesn't seem to be what Israel wants, Kelley. So what do you think is going on here?
Well, I mean, just to think how far this whole issue has come. Like when the Biden administration was even dipping its toe into having talks with both sides. I mean, the outrage that the Biden administration would even talk to Hamas, the outrage from Republicans, the outrage from pro-Israeli media, from the whole social media sphere, that they're terrorists. We can't talk to them. Now we're in a situation where we know now over the last weekend that the Trump administration was holding direct talks with Hamas without Israel, and basically engineering the release of this hostage, this American hostage. It was a major breakthrough, an absolute major breakthrough to get this guy out of there and home to his family. And, at the same time, Steve Witkoff, the Trump administration, Trump himself have been signaling that they want the end to the war. They've told Israel that they have to end the war, that they're going to do everything they can to get a ceasefire and bring an end to it. And it seems like the language has changed. It has changed dramatically from, say, last year, from even during the campaign. I'm very hopeful because along with all of this is this sense that the Trump administration is tired of being tooled around by Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's music to my ears because we know that Benjamin Netanyahu has enjoyed tooling American presidents, from Obama to Biden and even the first Trump term around. And he's boasted and bragged that we are easily led by the nose and that we'll do whatever he wants and whatever Israel wants. And so to finally see a president stand up to Benjamin Netanyahu and say, my country comes first, not yours. I think a lot of people are celebrating today. And I think what the neoconservatives in the media and in Washington writ large are really worried about is that they see that this cheering on of this independence from the Israeli government is not only coming from your usual quarters, the progressives, the left, anti-war elements. It's mainly coming from the right. Now, a lot of conservatives, people who voted for Donald Trump in the MAGA world, are saying, "Hey, we voted for America first, not Israel first." And that those voices are getting louder and louder, and neocons are running scared right now. And that's kind of been the chorus of the last week, is a real trouncing or a kicking in the pants of the old neoconservative guard. And I'm just very happy for that myself.
Yeah, so I think one of the real bright spots here is we even there's this tweet we have from Barak Ravid, who's one of the Axios reporters, and he's a real, just Israeli Washington APAC mouthpiece. But he's saying that Netanyahu is going to send a diplomat to Doha for talks with Hamas to try to bring about a ceasefire. Trump, is talking about having a ceasefire and the end to the fighting in Gaza, and that all sounds really good. I also don't want to, Charlie Brown myself here and go
Right.
running for that football, because if you remember at the beginning of the Trump administration, we had this 6-week pause in fighting. Steve Witkoff went to Israel and, told Netanyahu, like, you are going to accept this deal. We are going to have that ceasefire. And if you look at what happened, Israel got its hostages released, and they allowed in a little bit of aid, release some Palestinian prisoners, but ultimately the Palestinians are 3-4 months later back in the same famine conditions that they were under President Joe Biden.
Hmm.
And Hamas probably looks at it and says, well, the only difference is now we have half the hostages that we had before. So what do you think? Are we is this just Trump swinging back and forth, or do you think he's making a real definitive policy shift here?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we'd be pretty foolish if we believed everything at face value. So as I'm saying, I'm heartened by the change in language that Trump seems to be willing to move around Netanyahu, whether it be in the negotiations over Gaza or with Iran, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. We always have to keep in mind what happened in January. There was a ceasefire. It was brokered by Steve Witkoff. He had gotten a ton of accolades for that. I mean, people were saying, "Wow, this is a dramatic shift in diplomacy from the Biden administration." And then what happens? The Netanyahu government breaks the ceasefire 2 months later, and the Trump administration says, "Well, it's all Hamas's fault." They shut down the aid. They say that's Hamas's fault. You listen to the State Department briefings with Tammy Bruce, and she says everything that happens in the Gaza Strip, whether that's the Israelis using Palestinians for human shields, children dying from starvation, people getting hit in the back by fire, that's Hamas's fault. And so that is just really degrading, because you're like, wow, we're on some trajectory, and it seems like they pulled a fast one on us. So yes, I think we should always keep our eyes open and our mind open, and not put on any rose-colored glasses here. I think Steve Witkoff is really a surprising character. I remember being very angry with him when I saw him on Tucker Carlson just a couple of months ago. Basically, he had one of those long form interviews, and he seemed so in the pocket of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli side. And he had talked about how he had gone there, and how sympathetic he was to the families of the hostages. And he basically said that there's nothing that he could do, because if Hamas wants a deal, then Hamas is going to come to the table. When we knew, Kyle, that, and even the Israeli press was reporting at the time, that it was the Israelis that had put new demands on the table, that it wasn't just Hamas saying, "Hey, oh, there's a ceasefire agreement, we're just going to walk away." They had come to the table, and Netanyahu, who does not want to end this war, he just continued to gum it up with new demands. And Tucker did not push back on that, and I do appreciate all the work that Tucker's been doing on this issue and on the Iran issue. But I feel like there was very little pushback on Witkoff, who was really kind of arguing the Israeli side. And as an American, I want to see our diplomats basically serving as diplomats. If you're going in there and be a good faith broker, I don't want I don't want to see my diplomats mouthing one side's talking points over the other, and that's what he seemed to be doing. Now, you listen to him, and he often says things like, we need to talk. We need not be categorical. He's talking about the Iran deal, and like, he seems to be, again, one minute saying that we shouldn't demand full denuclearization. Another minute he seems to be a little bit more sanguine. So I just don't know. Like, like I said, he's a surprising character. He seems to be getting things done. We could talk more about the other foreign policy things that happened over the weekend with India and Pakistan and China as well. So I don't know. I mean, I honestly, as an observer of foreign policy in Washington, I feel like really in uncharted territory in terms of how things are unfolding. And I don't think there's anybody who's out there is telling the truth if they think that they can predict what's going to happen next.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. And, one of the things that I think makes Trump seem very unpredictable is I don't think he's very good at working the US bureaucracy still. Like, he's very good in the media,
Mhm.
but the Washington bureaucracy is a different story. And their APAC has a lot of leverage. And the situation in Gaza is also very complicated. At this point, Kelly, just having a ceasefire and having Israel end the killing, even if they start to and agree to allow food and water and medicine back into Gaza, long term, there has to be, tons and tons of rebar, cement,
Right.
construction equipment allowed into Gaza, water pipes, all things that Israel has said for years and years and years are just material that Hamas is going to one day use to make weapons.
Mm.
And, to the extent that Trump does have leverage over Israel, which the US leverage over Israel is extensive, but imagine if he was actually threatening to cut off weapon shipments to Israel. I would not be surprised to see super majorities of the House and the Senate vote on resolutions, if not laws, and override Trump's veto, demanding that U.S. aid has to go to Ukraine, that to Israel, Ukraine too, maybe, but
Yeah. Yeah.
particularly Israel, that the president does not get a choice, does not get a say. Our foreign policy is we send Israel billions of dollars in aid every year, and we also have, this is according to Israeli media, Benjamin Netanyahu saying that Israel needs to detox itself from American military aid. And then in that same interview, he's talking about how the campaign's going to go on. We're going to continue to destroy Gaza and go through with the home demolitions, and they will have nowhere to return to, he says. And so I guess, Kelly, does Trump at this point have the leverage that he needs to have to force Israel to stop? I mean, if Netanyahu really wants greater Israel, if he really wants to take Gaza, the West Bank, parts of southern Lebanon, and Syria, it seems like he kind of maybe has that. And he's saying, even if this loses Washington support at this point, I'm okay with that because look how much territory I've added to the Jewish state.
That's a great question. I really don't know how to answer it because I do think that, if push comes to shove, Trump could say, well, do what you got to do, but you're not getting any more money from us. That, and like you mentioned, Congress could push his hand on that, which would be interesting because Congress never fights back when we go in, when a president leads us into unauthorized wars, but they seem to get all hot under the collar and ready for action when they want to reverse a peaceful move or a move away from the brink or away from intervention. So it would be very interesting. I don't know. This Congress seems so cleaved to Trump right now. I mean, Trump got us into this massive trade war with China. He was issuing global tariffs. He was using emergency laws to do this. And it was only a few senators, a few Republican senators joined Democrats in trying to shut this down in terms of telling him he cannot use emergency powers to just slap tariffs on everybody on the globe. We're not in a national security emergency. And only a few senators joined. I mean, there are a few brave souls. and forget the House. The House had no desire. If anything, the House was changing the rules so that they couldn't have an anti-tariff vote. So I think they would be hard pressed to get a lot of Republicans to go against Trump, even on the aid issue. I mean, the Israel issue. Now you could say, "Oh my goodness," but AIPAC is so influential and so coercive on the Hill that maybe all of these members of Congress would cave. But I do think what you're seeing, Kyle, is a historic moment in Washington where that influence, that power, that control that AIPAC has had historically is shaking. I'm not saying it's gone. I'm not saying that it's crumbling, but I think it's starting to shake. And I do see signs of this if you're watching very closely, or maybe not so closely. But for example, Mark Levin, infamous radio jock, neoconservative hawk, like Uber, like got all, earned all his spurs during the global war on terror, being an Islamophobe, and your traditional loudmouth Republican conservative host, right? Old guard, old. He's not part of the new media whatsoever. He's been getting ratioed all over Twitter, or X these days, whenever he opens his mouth about Trump trying to forge a negotiated settlement with Ukraine and Putin, and Trump and Witkoff trying to get a nuclear deal with Iran. And he goes out there and he uses the same old tropes about fifth column Putinists on one hand, or Iran, loving anti-Semites on the other hand. And he gets ratioed in his comments, and they're not coming from your usual anti-war people on the left. It's all MAGA, it's all conservatives, it's all America firsters, and they're like, get the F out. We did not vote for this. You do not represent me, and Israel doesn't represent me, and I don't pay taxes to pay fealty to another country. Stop it. You're gone. And that's to me, that's just music to my ears. But it also is this clue or a signal that they don't have the grip anymore. Because in the old days, if you had tried to shut someone down with the anti-Semitic argument, people would scurry back into the shadows. They're like, I can't do that. And so many people would not stick up for themselves. They wouldn't write about Israel. They wouldn't criticize Israel publicly. And I see a massive reversal of that. And of course, there's safety in numbers. So the more people you have out there in popular culture and in the media, whether it be you or Glenn Greenwald or Breaking Points or Drop Site, and all these other media outlets in between, and on the right, that are talking openly and criticizing, I feel like the more they kind of shrivel up, kind of like the wicked witch of the West, when you sprinkle her with water and they're like, And so
Yeah.
I think Trump, if he does want to go full on against Netanyahu and test the theory, like, if we take away all that aid, what are you going to do? I think he's emboldened, because MAGA is not going to be unconditionally loyal to the Israeli cause anymore. I just don't see it. I mean, there's a split, but I don't see them all marching in lockstep behind Likud anymore.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your point there and insight, particularly about the right wing on Twitter. If you look at the polling, apparently like 50% of young Republicans, which that's Republicans under the age of 50, are opposed to the U.S. support for Israel, don't favor the U.S. special relationship with Israel. And, that young Republican crowd definitely that MAGA crowd has a lot of sway on discourse because of social media. As much as
Right.
people point out, claim that the pro-Palestinians in the US are these left-wing campus protesters, if you look online, a lot of it is these MAGA who they're maybe not pro-Palestinian, but they're certainly not pro having a special relationship with Israel, which is
Right.
just so important. Now, Kelley, before we wrap up here, I also had a question for you about the situation in Ukraine where I'm trying so hard to figure out what the Trump administration's policy is because we have Trump and Marco Rubio running around saying, in a few days, we're going to figure out if this is even worth pursuing. And so, what does it mean if it's not worth pursuing? Are we continuing the proxy war or are we cutting off aid to Ukraine? And this is a situation where Trump put out a post on Truth Social that really seemed to take the Russian side in demand here, where Putin's saying, I want to have talks with the Ukrainian leader on Thursday in Istanbul. Zelensky first rejects it, saying there has to be a ceasefire. And Trump says, no, go to the talks. You need to do this. And now Zelensky is saying that he's going to go, I guess, and talk to Putin without a ceasefire. So, Kelley, what do you make of this? Is Trump which side do you think is the one that's really irritating Trump at this point? Is it Zelensky or is it Putin?
I can't tell. It's probably Zelensky, because I would imagine that the Europeans who are pushing Zelensky to be so obdurate on this issue most times of the day really irritate Trump and get under his skin. But that said, it's really difficult to ascertain whether or not the Trump administration has a clear plan for how to mitigate all of this, or they are sort of bobbing and weaving and trying to make their way as all of these new threads and developments happen. I could tell you on the one hand, what the people I work with, the real experts are saying, and they're saying a ceasefire is not going to help. You need to get to the talks and you need to come to some real agreement on the core issues, the core issue of whether or not Ukraine is ever let into NATO. You have to give the Russians some assurance or the assurance that they've been looking for on the NATO question. That's fundamental. Then you have the issues of Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk and the territory that Russia holds today. You have the issue of the demilitarization that Russia is asking for. What does that look like? Do we have neutrality? Does the United States and Europe provide for some security for Ukraine? And what does that look like vis-a-vis Russia? And what are the levels that they would accept? So you have these really core issues, and they're all issues that had been, kind of hashed out in the 2022 talks in Istanbul that fell apart. So these aren't new issues, but those core things need to be settled before that you can just say ceasefire. Because if you do ceasefire and none of that is settled, then it's just going to become a time for Ukraine to try to arm up, catch a breath, and Russia to do the same. Russia could arm up, catch a breath, and engage in a new offensive. And so the people that I'm talking about would agree with Russia and Trump right now that the talks need to happen first. That just imposing a ceasefire or getting that agreement's not going to do anything but just stall and create just time for each side to rearm. And so on that score, maybe Trump was correct in putting out that Truth Social message, but it's not clear whether or not this talk is going to happen in Istanbul. I guess we're all waiting on the edge of our seats. But to your other point about the Trump administration, yeah, I think they are getting frustrated writ large, and you really have the risk of this whole thing falling apart, because if the Trump administration decides, okay, we're just going to walk away and let the Ukrainians and Europeans settle their business with the Russians themselves, I don't think it's going to work out very well for Ukraine, particularly if the United States starts withholding some of the aid, especially like intelligence sharing. They withhold intelligence sharing, the whole project, implodes because everybody, Europe and Ukraine, NATO, they all count on the United States to provide the intelligence, to provide coordinates, everything is networked with our assistance. And so if we withdraw that and we walk away, I think things could look really bad for Ukraine, which obviously puts Russia in the catbird seat, which they already are. But it gives them obviously more leverage. And who knows? Maybe Russia won't want to end the war at that point. Maybe they'll want to take more. So this is serious business.
Well, yeah, I definitely agree with you there, Kelly. It seems like basically since the start of this war, the Ukrainian leverage has only continued to trickle and get smaller and smaller and smaller. And they go so far as to cast aside the Americans because the Europeans are saying that we're going to support you. You know, the Americans may not be in it for as long as it takes anymore, but we are. You know, the amount of support the Europeans could give, it doesn't seem very large. You know, they're making a big deal out of $2 billion they took from interest off of frozen Russian assets that they're giving to Ukraine. But this is a drop in the bucket compared to what the US has given Ukraine over the past 3 years. So thinking that Europe is going to be able to replace the American support is very foolish. And once the Americans are disengaged, then Putin may decide that, you know, I will force the collapse of the Ukrainian military, and then I will dictate my terms to Zelensky.
Right.
It's not going to be a discussion where Ukraine gets to say, well, you know, you don't control all of Zaporizhia, so we're going to keep the parts there we control. You could have the Donbass, but we're going to,
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
may not be in that position anymore. And I mean, that does seem to be the way that we're going here. So, Kelly, any final
Yeah.
thoughts?
No, I mean, thank you for having me on. There's just too much going on to like really distill, but I'm excited. I'm hopeful. We didn't even get into US China, which I think that's a whole other area where there is some hope despite the trade war that like, everybody was freaking out about with, dealing with the stock market, Wall Street, all of that. It seems like there's some deals being made, and there actually might be more data in the offing between U.S. and China than they were in the past 4 years of Biden, which many people would be shocked to hear that. But I do think on all fronts, Trump is surprising us. I agree. We need to keep keep our minds and our eyes open and our rose-colored glasses off. But be happy to come back and talk about this more. But I think it's kind of going in a positive direction.
Well, I agree with you right now, Kelly. I'm concerned that, you know, in a month or so, when I have you back on the show, we're going to be
We
saying that,
pray.
man, everything has been going the wrong way over the past month. But 6 months, you know, after I have you on a couple more times, we talk about it. Nah, Trump is not, you know, that's the thing. Trump really keeps it interesting, at least, where, you know, the 4 years of highly choreographed Joe Biden, where everything is just establishment policy thrown at you and beaten into your face, him flip-flopping all over the place certainly presents at least a little more entertainment and hope that, you know,
Yeah,
sometimes you are going on the right path. So, Kelly, thank you so much for returning to the show, and I will definitely have you back on again.
awesome. Thank you, Kyle.